Jesus' answer to Simon Peter, 70 times 7, is an answer that really says without limit. How many times should I forgive? As many as 7 times? No. 70 times 7. Or 77 times, depending on your translation. It's a lot either way. And because 7 is the perfect number, it means there's no limit. What a challenging word from Jesus. And our question today is, well, if we are to forgive, and if forgiveness is so important, and it is, and we will see that, especially in the next few Sundays as we walk through this, then what is forgiveness anyway? Well, let me suggest some things that it's not, first of all. Forgiveness is not simply forgetting. And we tend to tie those things together. Forgive and forget, we say. But in fact, forgiveness is often involves a kind of remembering, a special kind of remembering. Not just forgetting. Forgiveness does not mean pretending like it didn't happen. Forgiveness does not mean saying, well, it happened, but it's not important. I mean, if it's worthy of forgiveness, it's important. It does not mean saying that what happened doesn't matter. Because in fact, it does matter. Otherwise, forgiveness would not be called for. Forgiveness does not mean that I submit myself again to the same sort of abuse. Or the same thing could happen again. Forgiveness does not mean pretending like it won't when I know it will. The classic example of that is domestic violence, abuse. Any kind of abuse, the way to handle that is to get away from it, to distance oneself from the abuser. Maybe there's an opportunity then for forgiveness. Maybe there's an opportunity then for reconciliation and for the healing of the one who is the perpetrator. But forgiveness does not mean submitting oneself again and again to abuse. So what is forgiveness? I want to focus on a definition that I think is helpful. It's a definition that I put together after doing some study with our staff, working through a program put out by the Fetzer Institute on forgiveness. And some reading also from the Templeton Foundation and their work on human nature and forgiveness. I think it's an important definition. I think it can help us imagine and to think about and work through the issue of forgiveness in our own lives. The definition is this. It is the difficult, intentional process of letting go of an old reality and opening oneself to the possibility of a new reality. Let me say that again. It is the difficult, intentional process of letting go of an old reality and opening oneself to the possibility of a new reality. It's that definition that I'm going to say several times this morning because I want us to take that with us and into the rest of the series. Because each word in it is important. And the first word is difficult. It is difficult. Now, I don't mean forgiving some little slight. You don't get an invitation to a party or somebody steps on your toe in the aisle of the sanctuary. And okay, that's easy to forgive. I'm talking about the hard, difficult work of forgiveness from a real injury of some sort. It's difficult. C.S. Lewis said, everybody believes in forgiveness until they have to do it. It rings true, doesn't it? Forgiveness is difficult. Gandhi said that forgiveness is not for the weak. It requires great strength to forgive. The second word is intentional. Difficult, intentional. When Jesus commanded us to forgive, just like when Jesus commanded us to love, what Jesus was communicating indirectly is that it's not about how we feel or something that just sort of happens, but there is an intentionality to our love. When he says love your enemies, it would be unnatural to expect us to have an emotional sort of love for our enemies, but it has to do with the intention of how we will live our lives and what we choose to do. Intentional. Forgiveness is intentional in that way. And it's a process. That's the third word. A difficult, intentional process. It would be nice if forgiveness was something that could just happen overnight. Well, forgive and forget. But it doesn't work that way. It's not the way we're wired. It's difficult, and it requires a process, an intentional process. A good example of that process comes from Landisville, Pennsylvania, a Mennonite community there. And they had a tragedy happen. A young man in their congregation named Keith Weaver, one Sunday afternoon after the family dinner, brutally murdered his parents and one of his sisters. It was horrible. It was a shock for the community. And no one could understand it or make sense of how such a horrible thing could happen in their congregation, and how these people whom they loved and respected, the friendships that they treasured, were just gone in an instant, and how this young man who had grown up in that community could do such a horrible thing. And they made the decision to enter this difficult, intentional process of forgiveness. And so they brought in chaplain and psychologist to help them deal with their grief and to work through this process toward forgiveness. They started a fund. You know what they called the fund? The 70 times 7 fund. A fund that would pay for the legal expenses for the perpetrator of this terrible crime, so that his remaining sister and brother would not bear that expense. And they visited him in jail and then in prison. They even took gifts to him. They prayed for him and for his family every day. They worked through an intentional, difficult process. On the first anniversary of this terrible crime, they had a memorial service. You see, that's part of forgiveness. It's this remembering, this acknowledgement that something terrible has happened. It's difficult. But it's this intentional process that leads us to forgiveness. The pastor, when asked about this, said that forgiveness is not something that happens one time, but it must happen again and again and again. He's referring to that process that community had to go through. And then forgiveness is letting go. It is a difficult, intentional process of letting go of an old reality. In fact, do you know that the Greek root of the word forgiveness means to let go? It means to give up. It means to throw away, to toss. And that's a part of the process of forgiveness. It's letting go of an old reality. It's letting go of the reality of that terrible pain. It's letting go of that grudge that is such a heavy burden and that can eat us alive. It's letting go of the old reality. I was reading about the story of Heidi Coffey. Heidi Coffey's husband, Gavin, was killed tragically in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. She invited that driver to the memorial service. People were outraged, some of them. Family members and friends could not understand why she would do such a thing. And she said, "It's because what my husband Gavin always said." She said, he said, holding a grudge is like drinking poison and waiting for someone else to die. So she refused to do it. What was she saying? That part of this difficult, intentional process is letting go of an old reality. No one said it was easy. In fact, I said it was difficult. And it may be the most difficult part of the process at all. To let go of that old reality in order to make room for a new reality. And that's the last part of that definition. To let go of the old reality and to open oneself to the possibility of a new one, a new reality. One that can be better, though different. One that may or may not involve a relationship with the one that we have had to forgive. But a new reality with promise and new life. I know of no better example in recent history of this than the example of the Nickel Mines Amish community in Pennsylvania. You may remember, in fact, we're coming up on the anniversary of the terrible tragedy in that community. A gunman went into the little Amish schoolhouse there, opened fire, killing 5 children and wounding 5 others. What a horrible tragedy. And the astounding thing is that the community responded by reaching out to the family of the gunman, who not only had killed the children, but had turned the gun on himself and ended his life. They collected money. They took food because they knew that they were left without a means of support. And they did the most remarkable thing, the most difficult and yet intentional thing, and that is they forgave. They made possible a new reality for all of them. There was an editorial that came out in the Dallas Morning News right after that terrible tragedy 6 years ago. And I want to close by reading the editorial to you. It's powerful. It's by Rod Dreyer. And I believe, at least for me, it was the most moving and powerful piece that I read about that tragedy. And to me, it speaks to us of the very definition of forgiveness. Difficult, intentional process of letting go of an old reality and opening oneself to the possibility of a new one. Here are his words. Is there any place on earth that more bespeaks peace, restfulness, and sanctuary from the demons of modern life than a one-room Amish schoolhouse? That fact is no doubt why so many of us felt so defiled, there is no more precise word, by news of the mass murders that took place there this week. If you're not safe in an Amish schoolhouse, and yet, as unspeakable as those killings were, they were not the most shocking news to come out of Lancaster County this week. No, that would be the revelation that the Amish community, which buried 5 of its little girls this week, is collecting money to help the widow and children of Charles Carl Roberts IV, the man who executed their own children before taking his own life. A serene Amish midwife told NBC News on Tuesday that this is normal for them. It's what Jesus would have them do. This is imitation of Christ at its most naked, journalist Tom Shackman, who has chronicled Amish life, told the New York Times. If anybody is going to turn the other cheek in our society, it's going to be the Amish. I don't want to denigrate anybody else who says they're imitating Christ, but the Amish walk the walk as much as they talk the talk. I don't know about you, but that kind of faith is beyond comprehension. I'm the kind of guy who will curse under my breath at the jerk who cuts me off in traffic on the way home from church. And look at those humble farmers putting Christians like me to shame. It is not that the Amish are Anabaptist hobbits, living a pure pastoral life uncorrupted by the evils of modernity. So much of the coverage of the massacre has dwelled on the innocence lost aspect, but I doubt that the Amish would agree. They have their own sins and tragedies. Nobody who lives in a small town can live under the illusion that it is a haven from evil. To paraphrase Gulag survivor Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the line between good and evil does not run along the boundaries of Lancaster County, but through every human heart. What sets hearts apart is how they deal with sins and tragedies. In his suicide note, Mr. Roberts said one reason he did what he did was out of anger at God for the death of his infant daughter in 1997. Wouldn't any parent wonder why God allowed that to happen? Mr. Roberts held on to his hatred, purifying it under pressure until it exploded in an act of infamy. That's one way to deal with anger. Another is the Amish way. If Mr. Roberts' rage at God over the death of his baby girl was in some sense understandable, how much more comprehensible would be the rage of those Amish mothers and fathers whose children perished by his hand? Had my child suffered and died that way, I cannot imagine what would have become of me for all my pretenses of piety. And yet, the Amish do not rage. They do not return evil for evil. In fact, they embody peace and love beyond all human understanding. In our time, religion makes the front pages, usually in the ghastliest ways. In the name of God, the faithful fly planes into buildings, blow themselves up to murder the innocent, burn down rival houses of worship, insult and condemn, and cry out to heaven for vengeance. But sometimes, faith helps ordinary men and women do the humanly impossible: to forgive, to love, to heal, and to redeem. It makes no sense. And yet it's the most sensible thing in the world. The Amish have turned this occasion of spectacular evil into a bright witness to hope. Despite everything, a light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Amen.